Good evening, everyone. My name is Becky. I'm the Programming and Collection Development Librarian here at Storrs Library. Thank you for joining us for Discoveries from Longmeadow Cemetery. This program is part of our Hidden Voices of History series, which is featuring stories about underrepresented and marginalized groups throughout history. We have a focus on our community and the broader New England world, mostly stories from that area, but also the scholars from that area as well. So we hope we'll see you at other programs. This program tonight is sponsored, it's a collaborative effort with Storrs Library, the Longmeadow Historical Society, and also the Longmeadow Adult Center. So thank you for their support as well. This program is made possible through the CARES Act funding to Federal Institute of Museum and Library Services, as administered by the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners. So tonight's program is presented by Betsy McKee, and she is a member of both the Longmeadow Cemetery Association and the Longmeadow Historical Society. She and her husband Al live in a home that was built in 1801 near the cemetery. And when they discovered that their home was built by a stonecutter, they began to dig a little deeper into the early gravestones in the Connecticut River Valley and nearby New England towns. So Betsy's going to discuss some of those stories from the early residents from the historic Longmeadow Cemetery. And you'll talk about some of the symbolism, some of the carvers, and just the stories in general from our cemetery. So thank you very much, Betsy, and welcome.
Okay, can you all see that?
Yep.
All right, great. So thank you for coming tonight, and I hope you'll learn something new about the cemetery right across the street. So here's one of our favorite stones. So the Longmeadow Cemetery is actually run by an association called the Longmeadow Cemetery Association, all volunteer organization that's a not-for-profit. So Becky already mentioned how we got started. We did some research on our old house to see who the people were who lived in it before us, and discovered that the original homeowner, Hermon Newell, and his wife, Lois Burt Newell, lived in the house, and he was a gravestone carver. Those are his family stones in the foreground of the picture here. Now, the house got moved over here in the 1850s, so this location is purely coincidence. So how we photographed gravestones. We started running around cemeteries in the area looking for gravestones made by our carver, Hermon Newell, and also kind of branched out into other carvers in other towns. And I think we have about 30,000 photographs right now. So we discovered that taking pictures of gravestones straight on doesn't work too well with full sun, because you lose the detail. And the same thing if they're in shadow. So we've discovered that using a full-length mirror actually works pretty well. And here you can see Al holding the mirror and my shadow there as I'm framing the shot. So here's a couple of stones from our cemetery here in Longmeadow. Kind of hard to read. This is what happens when you use the mirror. That raking light just jumps those details into view. So we actually prefer the stones to be in shadow and then use the mirror to get the light. Now the stone, most of it that was used in the cemetery across the street, came from the East Longmeadow portion of town, and that's a big hunk of rock there with this double team of oxen from East Longmeadow. This quarry is located about where the East Longmeadow DPW is today. And there were at one time an estimated 55 quarries in the east part of the village, many of them quite small, little backyard outcroppings. This is one of the quarry sites that's, you can still see the Pine Hill Quarry. It looks like the workmen just walked away at the end of the day and left everything there. But you can see the water here. This is what happened to several of the quarries in East Longmeadow, as they flooded. And they tried to drain them and continue to quarry, and they gave up eventually and decided it wasn't feasible. So you may have heard something about the symbolism on some of the old gravestones. This is one of the earliest things you see, the death's head or skull. It's kind of scary looking, skull-like teeth, wings kind of grimacing. At this point, they also refer to cemeteries sometimes as boneyards or graveyards rather than cemetery. Here's an example from eastern Massachusetts where it looks very anatomical. And they very often have that one missing tooth, and we don't know why. This one, also in eastern Massachusetts, is very deeply carved. It's probably 4 or 5 inches deep, so it really sticks out. But it makes the point. This is the place for the bones to rest. And then it sort of merged into this slightly more appealing cherub or angel or sometimes soul effigy. They look a little bit more human. They still have wings, kind of sprouting from the ears, a crown. This one even has hair. And notice the eyes are looking heavenward. This one's got very detailed wings, and this one's a very stylized wing, just a hint of a crown, no pupils, but they're not quite so scary. Then there's some of the more exotic things. This one at the top, we love this one. You see the hand of God coming out of the heavens, the clouds there holding an axe, and there's the tree that's been cut down. So the life cut short, or someone cut down in the prime of life. The same thing with this one. There's the tree, there's the axe. And this one in our own cemetery in Longmeadow, there's the scythe of death, and it's cut down this flower of youth. It's actually a 29-year-old woman. And this might be clouds, the heavens. A little more literal, time flies. And you'll notice the hourglass on some of the stones, and notice that the sand has all run out. So time's up. And again, one of our favorite stones, this is Naomi Woolworth. She's got everything. So she's got the death dart here. There's the scythe. If you've seen the figure of death with the thing he's carrying, that's the scythe. There's the hourglass with the sand all run out. And here's the rooster that's going to crow at the dawn of the resurrection. So think of the weather vane on the top of First Church. And then around the turn of the century, 1800 or so, there's a great interest in the classical Greek and Roman. So here we get this very classic urn and the weeping willow. And there's many different versions of this. Here's one that's a flat carved. This one's much more three-dimensional and architectural. So some terms you might see in old gravestones. You might see relict. It sounds like a bad thing, but relict just means a survivor, usually the widow. A consort is a spouse. Occasioned means caused by. And casually doesn't mean what you think. It means accidentally. So here's a memory of Mr. Earl Cooley, who by a casual blow in a well died. Now, he didn't just casually die. He accidentally died. And what happened with this gentleman, we found out, was that he was working in a well, digging a well, and someone up above dropped a heavy tool like a sledgehammer on his head. So a casual blow, like a blow to the head. Genealogy, there's a way to discover things about people that left no other record. So here's a fabulous stone. We love the bowling ball effect here. This one's in Enfield for Captain Ephraim Peace. He died in 1801. His first wife, Tabitha, died before him in 1787, but he married again. So here's the second wife, Rebecca, who dies in 1802. So how did she manage this? Because this is one stone, Ephraim and Tabitha. So this is what Rebecca did, wife number 2. She staples her stone onto the side. So she has a stone made just like her husband and the first wife and has it stapled together. This lady, here's some genealogy for you. If you're ever doing some research, here's the stone you want to find. So Mrs. Hannah Kibbe was first the wife of Samuel King, second, the wife of Jabez Bradley, third, the wife of Benjamin Harrington, and died as the relict or widow of Israel Kidby. So it's all here on her stone. And then you've heard the joke, you know, it's not carved in stone. Well, it is carved in stone. So what do you do when you make a mistake? Patty, Polly, you know, you can't erase it. And how old was she? Oops. There's also stories that are carved into the stones, not just the dates and the names and who they married, but what happened to them, how they were killed. Here's one from the Longmeadow Cemetery of young Gaius Bliss, who was instantly killed by a bull at the age of 15. And when we first saw this, we thought, 15-year-old teenage boy, he was probably telling his friends he could cross the field before the bull caught up to him and he didn't make it. But probably not. We learned going to Sturbridge, that's one of the Sturbridge animals there, that teenage boys were often in charge of the oxen and other farm animals, the training of them and the management of them. And he probably just got the bull on a bad day, and those horns are lethal. So why is this on his gravestone? Perhaps because it was a cautionary tale, a warning. This is what can happen if you don't pay attention. Here's a couple more. This one, this young man died by smallpox by inoculation. So not just dying of smallpox, and it's always referred to as the smallpox, but smallpox by inoculation. So this is before vaccination. So very pertinent today. When they were using smallpox inoculations, they were actually taking some material from an infected person and introducing it under the skin, so you would hopefully get a mild case of smallpox and develop antibodies and be immune. And it often worked. Didn't always work the way they planned. So here it is, this young man, he got a fatal case. Now this is 1778. It was a time of a big smallpox epidemic, and there were many. This is during the Revolutionary War. And George Washington was one of the people who was advocating for inoculation so that his troops wouldn't all be knocked down by the disease. And this young man, Solomon Burt, he was suddenly killed by the blowing up of a powder mill, also during the Revolutionary War. Now his father, David, owned a powder mill located in Springfield near the Mill River, predictably. And he was making and selling gunpowder to all over the area to the Patriots, thank goodness. This powder mill blew up. A sudden spark of any kind would have set that off. And this young man and one other were killed in that explosion. There are other instances of powder mill accidents. There's one in Glastonbury, there's a couple in Southwick that are marked on the stone. Jerusha here, she was the consort of Lyman, so she died before him. And she was the daughter, also the daughter of the late Mr. Samuel Williams. So they're getting a little genealogy in his story too. But she died of cancer. So they recognized cancer and knew that she had died of it and put it on her gravestone. This young man, Theodore Benton, was from New York. He was here visiting when he passed away. So embalming was not available. They couldn't send his body back to New York. So he was buried here and he got a lovely gravestone. So I'm guessing his friends that he was visiting might have been the ones to arrange that. Nathaniel Burt, great stone, 1755. This is the only stone we have of this type, and it's quite rare. It's called a box tomb for obvious reasons. And Nathaniel Burt, this writing on the top, describes how he died. In memory of Lieutenant Nathaniel Burt, who was slain in the memorable battle near Lake George, September 8, 1755, when his colonel and other brave officers fell, yet a signal victory was obtained over the enemy. So this is the battle known as the Bloody Morning Scout. And it was a famous battle. Several people from this area fought in it, September 8th. In the archives of the Longmeadow Historical Society, we have a letter written to Nathaniel Burt at Crown Point by his wife and daughter, who were both named Sarah, that missed arriving in time for him to see it. His lieutenant wrote a note on it and sent it back, because at the point that he had arrived with the letter that he had already passed away. Oh, and we learned that there's nothing inside that box. So just in case you were wondering, when there was some restoration done in this stone, we found that the bodies are underground just like every other gravestone. So there's nothing in that box. Here's some more typical table stones. Only the rich and very important people got tables, a lot of writing. The epitaphs also tell a story. Here's a pretty typical one. Death is a debt to nature due, which I have paid, and so must you. So basically, this is where everybody's going to end up. Now, you might have noticed that there's some funny looking letters, like here, the first letter of so, and this in must. These are S's. It's called the long S. And it eventually went out of fashion, but at this time they're still using this long S. So it looks like an F, but it's not. Now here's a lovely verse. This is Jonathan Burt's tomb or stone, and he's got this nice poem at the bottom. How short, how precarious, how uncertain is life, how quick the transition from time to eternity. How soon the thread of life is spun, a breath, a gasp, a groan or two, and we are seen no more, yet on this brittle thread of life hangs a vast eternity. So it's a lovely verse. Now, you might wonder where they got this verse. So this was written by Reverend Hezekiah Goodwin from Bloomfield, Connecticut, who died some almost 30 years before Jonathan Burt. And there's Hezekiah's stone. And what it says at the bottom is his epitaph composed by himself upon his deathbed is as follows. So he wrote that on his deathbed, had it put on his stone. 30 years later, and how many miles away, Jonathan Burt's family had it put on his stone. Don't know if it was published. Okay, Samuel Colton, his is the table in the middle. Those are his two wives. He was Merchant Colton, very prominent, wealthy, very wealthy citizen of town, had a store. What they chose for his stone is a poem by a female poet, which is unusual, called Ode to Spring, which might seem odd, but here's the verse. The sun's too quick revolving beams, apace dissolves the humane dreams and brings the appointed hour. Too late we catch his parting ray and mourn the idly wasted day no longer in our power. So basically a seize the day kind of thing. So it just happens to be a poem about spring. Here's one of our favorites, Abigail Colton. You see this little hand down here to make sure you see it. It says, here, reader, mark, perhaps now in thy prime, the stealing steps of never standing time. Thou'lt be what I am, catch the present hour, employ that well, for that's within thy power. So again, seize the day, don't waste the time that you have. And the stone carvers themselves, you might be surprised to learn that we had quite a few stone carvers in Longmeadow, very skilled. Now, before we had our own carvers here in town, people were bringing stones up from Connecticut from the Thomas Johnson shop. He and his family were big into gravestone carving in Connecticut, and they shipped these stones all over the place. So here's one for John Gunn of Westfield. Notice the spelling of Westfield. Quartermaster. He died in 1726. His daughter lived in Longmeadow, which is why we think he was buried here. We think he was here with her. And Johnson's known for these wonderful, I think they look like dancing dolphins and the border and this beautiful rosette, and there's that death's head. Now the one next to it is for Samuel Colton, the merchant's father, also a Johnson stone, and you see he died in March 1743/4. Well, what does that mean? They couldn't decide? No, it was during that time between the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. So if you were born in or died in the first 3 months of the year, it was which year do you go by? It didn't really become standard to use the Gregorian calendar until 1752. So at this point, they were still doing that /4344. So here's the next, probably the first carver we had here in Longmeadow was Mr. William Holland. And this information was found from the archives at the museum in Springfield. And it describes agreeing with Mr. Jonathan Hale and his brother John. Yes, they really did name their two sons John and Jonathan. So for 2 pair of gravestones for their parents. So Mr. Holland is arranging this deal. So Thomas Hale died in 1750. So it took 7 years for the 2 boys to decide to buy their parents a stone. Their mother died in 1719. So they were doing both stones quite a few years after the deaths. The Stebbins shop, again, a prolific local family using Longmeadow stone, beautiful fine-grained red stone or sandstone. The Stebbins shop was also known for these beautiful scrolls, very nicely done. Here's another one with the Stebbins shop. Beautiful scrolls, very deeply carved. And a simple but very, very effective hourglass, very deeply carved, and 2 thistles. It's a symbol you see elsewhere in Eastern Mass fairly often, but not common around here. And then our own Hermon Newell. So Hermon and his son Simeon were both carvers. And here's Hermon has signed the stone H. Newell, sculptor. So he considered himself a sculptor. And these are examples of a couple of his stones. Very nice smooth grained stone, nicely lettered, lined up, planned. And there's this more architectural theme that he and his son actually seem to favor. That little stippling in the background, very nicely done. So some more research. So Stephen and Elijah Colton's daybook is in the collections at the Archives of the Historical Society. And in there we find that Hermon Newell was paid in 1824 by Gravestone for Othniel, $7. So it cost $7 for that stone. Also by a small pair of gravestones, $5, which we believe is this one. And by painting gravestones. What does that mean? 33 cents to paint gravestones. So imagine, we've heard of this in other places, but not commonly. Did they paint them black to look like slate, because that was more fashionable? Did they paint them white to look like that new marble? Or were they possibly painted in several colors? Were they polychrome? Imagine the cemetery with colorful stones. And maybe they did this commonly and we just don't see it because it didn't last. Maybe it washed off. Eber Stebbins, another one of the Stebbinses, he favored this kind of grape leaf pattern and the wig, which looks a bit like a caterpillar, but that's the wig. And Elijah Burt, very fancy. He threw everything on here. There's a little star, there's the crown, there's wings, there's scrolls. He did this stone for his niece, Clarissa. Now you might wonder how these stones hold up. Pretty well, actually. This was a workshop we did with Joe Farinini. He's an expert in gravestone restoration. And he held this workshop to show us and some volunteers. There's Brewster Sturdivant, for anybody who knows Brewster. He showed us how to clean the stones safely with the right tools and the right product. So he advocates the use of D2. And you have to choose your stones carefully because some of those stones look like they wouldn't handle this kind of treatment, but does a very nice job. Here's one of those stones from Connecticut, which I wouldn't attempt to do unless you were expert at it, but you can barely read it, right? After cleaning, it's now legible. But this stone you can see has some little problems and it's fragile, so we don't recommend cleaning gravestones like that unless you are expert. Repairs. I mentioned this box tomb needed to be repaired. When we saw this stone, it was the sides were caving in, and that top stone is very heavy, as you can imagine. So we didn't want the whole thing to collapse. So we hired someone to come and do the restoration. So here's the scaffolding. They lifted the top up, reset all the sides so it's now secure and safe. That's when we confirmed there was nothing inside the box. And Lydia here, this bottom part of her stone was all that was in the ground. So that little ragged, broken tooth looking thing, we found the top later on had been stored away in a shed and was actually in pretty good shape. So we had that reassembled. It's not a pretty repair, but at least she's back together. This one you might think is a goner. Looks pretty bad. It had spalled right off the front, so the whole front layer of the stone just crumbled and had fallen off. But there it is, reassembled like a giant puzzle. So the Longmeadow Cemetery got started early on when the town was set up as a separate precinct. And the highway they're referring to here was William Street. So the highway was first laid out 10 rods wide, and then that strip 4 rods wide upon the south. Anyway, a rod is 16 feet. So they took that road, they carved out a strip 4 rods wide by 40 rods long to create the original burying ground. And that's roughly an acre. So that was the original part of the cemetery. The oldest stone we have in the cemetery is Mary Colton, alias Drake, in other words, her maiden name, died 1682. But she was probably buried first in Springfield, and the stone was moved here. The first burial here, we think, was 1719. And when the railroad went through Springfield in 1848, the cemetery that was there down by the river was disturbed, and they actually removed the remains and stones and moved them to many other cemeteries. Many of them went to the cemetery in Springfield up on Maple Street. And the old burying ground section of this cemetery in Longmeadow is part of the historic district. So how did old cemeteries used to look? Kind of like this one. Weeds, tall grass, groupings of stones. The headstones in old cemeteries usually face west. So the body is behind the headstone. That way the person is facing east and the rising sun. So when the resurrection day comes, they're facing the rising sun in the east. So if you're standing out there reading a stone, you're not standing on the remains. And the stones are usually in loose family groupings and they're sold in pairs. Headstone and footstone, just like a headboard and a footboard on your bed. So here's a headstone. There's the footstone. You see how the words are facing the other way. So if you're reading this stone, the body is over here. And here's a group of headstones and footstones in the cemetery. So here's a little headstone. There's a little footstone. You see it, same shape. Headstone, footstone. And here's a little obelisk with a footstone. We've never seen another obelisk with a footstone. That's usually the exception to the headstone, footstone. But for this one that Hermon signed right there, he also created a footstone. It's cute. And here's my husband demonstrating the headstone, footstone. So that's where the body would be, between the headstone that's facing the other way and the footstone that's facing towards you. So we have found a few of the footstones, but many of them got buried. Here's one that got buried. And we set it back up in its appropriate spot. we'd like to do that with the rest of them. There's probably a few more under there that are just underground. And how do cemeteries get neatened up? Well, here's one in Pittsfield where all the stones are neatly lined up, almost touching shoulder to shoulder. It makes it easier to mow. Here's what happens to footstones in other places. They become walls, sometimes sidewalks. Longmeadow didn't escape this. It got neatened up in 1868. So here's a committee saying that they want to beautify the burial place, laying out the avenues and hardening the roads and removing footstones and writing and straightening headstones. This happened in 1868. So we assumed that's what happened in this cemetery. So stones in the oldest section here mostly face William Street, which is north. One row facing south, so they don't face the usual west. Table stones are oriented north and south. Most of the footstones are missing, like I said. Neat rows, not family groupings. So we assume that in 1868, they did like happened in other cemeteries where they rearranged it to make it easier to mow. Here's an old photograph, 1912, Casalio Emerson, glass plate negative collection at the Historical Society, looking very much like it does today. Neat rows. There's a view the other direction looking west towards the church. There's that hardening of the road they mentioned. So skip forward. We did some special kinds of scanning. So here's Tom Elmore doing LiDAR scanning. Now, the gadget is this thing he's holding up here. And this actually measures everything that's above ground and gives you a three-dimensional view of everything that's above ground. So it uses laser, reflected light. I don't pretend to understand that. Okay. We also did ground penetrating radar. So this you've seen done before. It can find underground utilities, foundations of old buildings, that kind of thing. So we had a GPR scan done of just the oldest section of the cemetery. So why did we do this? We wanted to find out if the bodies were moved when the cemetery got neatened up, where people were buried who didn't have a stone now. We wanted to find out if we could plant trees in some of these places that look like they're empty, make a permanent record of the stones, and because it really is very cool. So here's the cemetery from the sky, about 10 acres altogether. And that's the area that we did GPR, so the ground penetrating radar, the first go round. The second go round, we actually added the rest of this section. This is what a GPR image looks like from the side. So that's ground level up here. This is the level that's never been disturbed. And these little humps here are what they consider to be signs of disturbance or burials. Okay. This is what the GPR scan looks like when they do the color coding. So this happens to be 1.7 feet to 2.2 feet down. They did a series of scans from shallow all the way to, I think, 8 feet. What we discovered is that most people are not buried 6 feet under. So these colorful blobs represent the amount of disturbance. I found this hard to understand. So colorful blobs, areas of disturbance. Doesn't tell you why. It could have been a tree. Okay. We did not see, unfortunately, little coffin-shaped objects or skeletons. Here's one of the LiDAR images. This is why I think it's so cool, because this is what the LiDAR image can show you is there's an obelisk there. Here's a fence. Here's the driveway. You can see where some of the table stones are, like here and here. And you can actually do scanning every year if you want to watch if stones are tilting or leaning and to maintain the cemetery. So what we did, and this was fairly new, this is kind of revolutionary, is we had these two people working together to combine the LiDAR scan of the above ground image with the GPR data from underneath. So these shadowy gray areas are the LiDAR images, the stones. The ovals are where the burials were, those disturbances were found with the GPR. So I'm going to give you a close-up. So here's a close-up of the end towards the church driveway. So you'll see, here's the gravestones looking like a dental impression. Here's bodies. Okay, mostly makes sense. Here's a couple of gravestones with no body. But look at this whole area here. A little haphazard, not so neat. Most of them don't have stones. These little dots here are not gravestones. Those are the property line granite posts. So what does this mean? And this is also the new section we just did. This area was not as clear. We're not sure why yet. More disturbances, more homogeneous looking disturbances. There's that mound, a little hill. So the disturbance on GPR was a little more, a little less specific. So more work to do on that. So what do the unmarked graves mean? They may have always been unmarked. They may have been marked with something impermanent like a wooden marker, or they may have had some kind of marker that's now gone, a stone that broke, who knows. Those unmarked places might be the graves of enslaved people, Native Americans, indigent residents. So as an example of some of our research, don't worry about the details here, but this is archival research done by Beth Hoff, one of our Historical Society board members, following Catherine Bliss, who was one of the town's paupers. So she's being boarded with various people. She's being taken care of by a doctor. Here in 1805, she's died. So you see David White is making a coffin. Kelvin Burt's making a shroud. Walter Coombs is digging her grave. She has no gravestone, at least not today. So this is an example of one of those people that is lost to the written record, perhaps, didn't get a gravestone, but yet she lived here and she was taken care of by the town. Here's another story, someone who didn't have a marker. This is the will of George Colton, 1758. He's describing in his will that he wants to give his wife and his son my two Negro men, Peter and Caesar, to their dispose forever, and I hereby will and ordain that they shall well maintain them during their natural lives. So he's putting in his will what he wants to happen to his property, which includes these two Negro men. Now, some places we've been where we've been looking at gravestones, they have stones that are obviously made for servants, or, as probably the case, slaves. Here lieth two Negro servants. That's in Providence. Here's one, body of Sicily, Negro, late servant to Reverend William Brattle. So in some cemeteries, it's quite obvious. We don't have anything that says that here. So we are still not sure. Slavery in Longmeadow, it was here. Usually only wealthy or prominent persons could afford to buy and keep slaves. So far in the written record, we found at least these folks, that merchant, Samuel Colton, Thomas Fields, Samuel Keep, the rest of this group, including the Reverend Stephen Williams, owned slaves, and there probably are others. We're still discovering some of these. Here's an example of somebody who lived here in Longmeadow, Zickery, ended up leaving town and was buried elsewhere, but we see a record of him in Samuel Bliss's will. So he's bequeathing his Negro boy Zickery to his beloved cousin. In his probate, he's got this Negro called Zickery. He's baptized in the first church. He's being given to another family member, ends up moving to Connecticut and serving in the Revolutionary War, and is killed in a battle in Fishkill, New York, where he dies after being injured. So he's buried in Fishkill, but he was a Longmeadow resident. Here's some of the discoveries in the archive records. The town of Longmeadow to making coffin for Jack Negro. That's all we know about this person. So this is another one of the records that shows someone's being paid to be taken care of. So the town of Longmeadow is taking care of this person named Jack Negro. Susan Freedom. So we have her indenture. So the selectmen and overseers of the poor of the town of Longmeadow bind Susanna Freedom, a pauper of said town, with the free will and consent of said Susanna, bound and apprentice to Thomas Dwight of Springfield. So again, she's one of the town's poor. She's being apprenticed out to Thomas Dwight in Springfield. So she was a Longmeadow resident. And here's the death record from the vital records in Springfield. Susan, a mulatto girl, died December 1803, formerly a servant to Colonel Dwight, aged 19 years. She completed her indenture in 1802 and was working for the Dwight family, receiving a salary when she died of scarlet fever a year after completing her indenture. Thomas Dwight arranged to have her have a gravestone. This one's in Springfield. The town of Longmeadow to Daniel Webster, to a coffin for Charles Thompson, to conveying said coffin from the shop to Abiel Hancock, and also to digging a grave for Charles Thompson. We do not have a stone for Charles Thompson. So again, he's one of the town poor. He's being taken care of by the town, but did not get a gravestone. So we have more research to come. There's a few more places to look, a few more pieces of paper to pour through. This is Moon Shadow. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Betsy. Oh, and thank you for the screen share. I've got some applause in our audience. So I do have a couple of questions from during the presentation that I want to get started with. The first one is someone was wondering how often the stones get cleaned and who does that?
They get cleaned when somebody requests it or when we have time to do it. So it should be done more often and we have many stones to do. So if anybody wants to help, let me know.
And somebody asked, the same person asked another question, but it's kind of tied into a question that came after it. They were wondering if the grave photos you've taken have been entered into the Find a Grave website. And someone else asked if all of the stones are photographed because they're an out-of-state descendant who would like to look through the photographs. So are these accessible anywhere else?
Very good questions. I have not loaded them up to Find a Grave because I find it too daunting with 30,000 pictures in my collection. Yeah. Many of them from the oldest section are on the Longmeadow Cemetery website. So you can look there, but if anybody is looking for a particular picture, we have improved on those pictures over the years, and I'm happy to share any picture anybody needs.
Is there an email address, the Longmeadow Historical Society?
Longmeadow Cemetery at Gmail.
Okay, great. Just put that in the chat box for anybody. Longmeadow Cemetery at gmail.com?
Yep.
Okay. Oops, I'm sorry. I sent that to somebody who had asked a question. I'm going to send it to everyone.
The Historical Society works too. I'll answer either one.
Okay. Longmeadow Cemetery. Someone asked, would everyone buried in our cemetery have been congregational or other denominations represented?
It's, that's a good question. At the time, the church, the town, the parish was basically all one thing. So the parish was the town. You could live in town and be buried in the cemetery. It's not a denominational cemetery. It continues to be an active cemetery today, and it's non-denominational. So I would think that anybody of any faith could be buried there.
Okay. Somebody asked, and I'm not sure if maybe they could provide some information, if we'll be offering anything to purchase with the information you shared tonight. So I'm not sure if they're talking about prints. So if the person who entered that question into the chat box, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on that a little bit. We don't have anything for purchase affiliated with this program presentation tonight. But if there's something else you're thinking of, please, feel free to let us know and we'll look into that. Somebody did enter a question in the chat box. Could those scrambled bodies in the northwest corner be from a time of war or disease?
It's actually the southwest corner. Time of war or disease, I don't think so. What we believe, the original 1 acre of the cemetery as it was created did not start at the church and work to the east. It actually started towards the west end of the oldest section and expanded to the west. Then they made a decision to not go any further than 200 feet from the street. Now this is all when the church is still on the green. So they decided not to go further than 200 feet from the corner, which we've pasted off as basically from the front of First Church, the street, to the other side of the driveway. So I think it would have been used as, it's probably the outskirts of the cemetery. I don't think so. There are some cemeteries where we've seen people who died from smallpox buried off on a far corner because maybe they're concerned about contagion, but I don't think so in this case.
Okay.
But we don't really know. We aren't going to ever really be able to know, short of digging something up and doing DNA. And I don't think we have something like that that's there. You saw those images. It's squiggles.
Yeah.
No little coffins.
Right. So the person did elaborate on their question about purchase. They said prints along with information on what the carvings represented on the headstones.
We don't have anything currently for sale, but I would entertain that if anybody has something specific they would like.
So if they have any requests or suggestions, should they maybe use that email to talk with you about that further?
Yep. We're going to write a book someday. Yeah.
What's that?
We're going to write a book someday.
So I don't have any more questions in the chat box at the moment. Did anybody else have a question that they wanted to ask? Any comments that they wanted to share? I don't see anyone who has unmuted themselves, but I do want to give people a moment in case they're typing something. Oh, okay. So the headstone that mentioned death by inoculation was fascinating. Have you seen any others like that?
Yes. We actually have an interest in causes of death found on gravestones. So I've got a whole collection of causes of death, including inoculation and all kinds of other things, from pitchforks to forges to trains to you name it.
And the person who had asked about the prints for sale said thank you and they will contact you. So we appreciate that, Betsy.
Okay. And anybody who wants to help clean stones, let me know. We'll do a workshop and we'll put you to work.
Do you I know you have the Historical Society has a weekly newsletter. Is there anything for the cemetery that if people are interested in updates or anything that they could subscribe to, or is that email the best way for people to reach you right now?
We have a website and we also have a Facebook page. So
okay. So
LongmeadowCemetery.org is the website.
Okay.
We're keeping it simple.
Yes. Someone asked, are all the causes of death listed in the Longmeadow Cemetery?
Listed where?
Doesn't specify. All the causes of death listed in the Longmeadow Cemetery. I'm not sure if they mean on the headstones. If there's
no, we have found causes of death in other records that are not noted on the stone, so they didn't always do it. If we look in the Centennial book with history of Longmeadow, there's many causes of death that are listed there that are not on the gravestones, but there are quite a few out there.
Right. We have a lot of people saying how fascinating this was, that it was very interesting and they enjoyed it, and thanking you for sharing your work and all this information. Which again, thank you, Betsy. This was a great presentation. We've
And,
got a
and,
lot
we're,
of,
and we're still doing research, so there's going to be more we'll find, and we'll try to find more information about who those unmarked burials might represent.
so we had somebody who said that they're going to be signing up. You'll get their effort to help clean the stones.
Awesome.
Watch for that. So we have 2 more questions. Were stone carvers well paid?
That's a good question for my husband to answer. Unmute yourself.
They were mechanics, so they were paid better than an average yeoman or farmer, but they weren't as wealthy as merchants or doctors. And the fact that they were being paid for gravestones meant that they often were paid in cash, which was kind of handy, because many people had to work in trade. So when they were paid by settlement from an estate, or monies that were from an estate settlement through family. And that was a very handy thing for a stonecutter to have.
So if the average wage at the time for a mechanic was 33 cents to 50 cents a day, you get a sense of how long, you know, for a $5 gravestone. That's a good amount of money.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question. We have another comment. They said it was very interesting. This person and their son visited the cemetery last summer, and it was so neat to watch this together and to learn even more. And they can't wait to go back and look for the hourglass and other images we pointed out. So
Great.
thank you for the family-friendly event, Betsy.
Okay, good.
Joining us. Someone asked someone said that they've seen headstones about a favorite wife. Have you seen that?
I've not seen one about a favorite wife. So interesting. Yes, we've seen all kinds of stories about, you know, spouses, like the one where somebody accuses the wife of poisoning the deceased with arsenic. And that's on the stone.
And then in Enfield, the wife is worth more than rubies, right?
Oh yes, there's one where she's described as being worth more than rubies. So we like that.
Nice.
So there are some compliments as well.
So not relating to the gravestate, but kind of the inspiration behind your research and exploration in this is someone asked, did you learn anything else interesting about your house?
Oh, of course. Still learning. We found a diary from 1883. So describing the year in the life of the owner at the time, who was an Irish immigrant working on the railroad. We found boots behind the chimney, shoes and boots. That was apparently an old world good luck charm to put shoes and boots behind the chimney. Oh. We have found all kinds of things in the ground: bottles, pipes, toys, coins, rings. Nothing valuable, unfortunately, but lots of interesting stuff in the ground.
Right. Well, I don't have any other questions at the moment. More people saying thank you for sharing this and how much they appreciate it. So I guess we'll call for any final questions or comments before we head out for the night. And
what I intend to do as soon as it's possible with social distancing is return to doing the burying ground tours.
So anybody who wants a guided tour, let us know.
Yes.
All right, thank you everybody for coming, and stay tuned for more information as we learn more.
Yes, thank you everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.